Hey, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something, well, pretty interesting, I think. We're diving into the whole world of sexual morality.
It's one of those areas where, our deepest instincts and like societal expectations kind of collide.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big one. And to help us unpack all of this, we're turning to the work of evolutionary psychologist David Buss and some of his colleagues.
Buss's work is, well, it's really interesting. He gets into how evolution has actually shaped how we judge what's right and wrong when it comes to sex.
Exactly. So we're going to be talking about things like jealousy, who we're attracted to, even how we compete to find a partner. A lot to cover. But before we get into all that, let's say some groundwork. Buss and his team, they came up with this idea of what they call the 7 pillars of sexual morality.
And it's not just about simple good and bad. It's more like 7 different, I guess you could say, dimensions that we use to look at sexual behavior.
So it's more nuanced than just like a thumbs up or thumbs down kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what are these pillars?
Well, you've got infidelity, of course. Then there's short-term sex,
Uh,
sexual coercion.
right.
Outgroup sex, so that's, sex with someone outside your social group.
Makes sense.
Then there's long-term mating, same-sex sexuality, and lastly, paraphilic sex, which is basically behaviors that are considered outside the typical, I guess you could say, norms.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack there, but one of the things that really jumped out to me from the research was how men and women, well, they seem to view these pillars a bit differently.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's almost like they're working from different moral playbooks, so to speak.
Exactly. And luckily, evolutionary psychology gives us some pretty compelling explanations for why that might be. Let's start with something that, well, everyone's probably got some opinions on. Short-term sex. Buss found that women, they tend to be way harsher when it comes to judging casual sex compared to men. And this wasn't just like a hunch or something, right? They actually studied this.
They did, yeah. They actually asked people how open they would be to having a one-night stand, and the difference between men and women, it was really clear.
Interesting. So thinking about all this from an evolutionary standpoint, why would women be less into the idea of, casual hookups?
Well, you got to think about it in terms of like reproductive investment. For women, a short-term thing could lead to pregnancy and then obviously the huge responsibility of raising a child, right? But men, on the other hand, they just don't have that same biological, I guess, imperative.
Right, I see what you're saying. It's like the stakes have always been higher for women historically, so it makes sense that they'd be more cautious.
Yeah.
Does this kind of difference in perspective, does that show up when we're talking about infidelity too?
Oh, absolutely. And while both men and women, they'll condemn infidelity, their reasons, well, they often are coming from different places. For men, sexual infidelity is a huge deal. I mean, just imagine the uncertainty of raising a child that might not be yours,
Hmm.
right? It's a threat to their, I don't know, genetic legacy in a way.
Yeah, it's like this primal fear almost of not knowing if you're really the father.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where that difference in judgment really comes in. Research has found that men tend to be way more troubled by the actual act of sexual infidelity, whereas
Women are more focused on the emotional side of things.
exactly. Because for women, when someone is emotionally unfaithful, that often means a potential loss of resources and commitment. And those things, well, evolutionarily speaking, they're crucial for raising a family.
Right. So it's almost like men are guarding against like, the classic cuckoldry scenario, and women are guarding against being left high and dry.
Yes, exactly. It all goes back to those deep anxieties about survival and security that are still playing out in our relationships today, even if we don't realize it.
Wow. Okay, so we've got these 7 pillars of sexual morality. We've got men and women viewing them through these like slightly different lenses.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff. But before we go any further, I think we should take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute to dive into more of this with David Buss's research. All right, so we're back, and we're ready to dig even deeper into this whole sexual morality thing.
Yeah, we've been talking about these differences between how men and women see things, but how does that actually, play out in the real world? Like when people are looking for partners, how do those evolutionary instincts actually show up?
Okay, so you talk about like dating,
Huh.
attraction.
Exactly. Like what are the tactics that people use to, well, to attract a mate? Buss's research actually gets into that too.
Okay, this I gotta hear. Give me the goods.
All right. So one thing they found is that men, they're more likely to, I guess you could say, brag a bit, especially when they're trying to impress a potential partner.
Mhm.
They might show off their accomplishments or talk about their resources.
Okay, so like the classic, peacocking kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
think flashy cars, expensive watches, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It's all about signaling to potential mates that they can provide and protect. But on the flip side, women tend to focus more on, well, enhancing their appearance.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, think about how much time and money, let's be honest, we spend on things like makeup, clothes, going to the gym.
It's true. And the research backs that up. They found that women were way more likely to say that they'd like wear makeup or go on a diet specifically to try to attract a mate.
Interesting. Whereas men, you said they were more likely to brag about their jobs or how much money they made.
Exactly. It's like we're speaking two different languages, but we're both aiming for that same goal, which is, finding a partner. But it makes you wonder, is it really all just about appearances and status? Like, don't things like personality and intelligence matter at all in this whole equation?
Right, because nobody wants to end up with someone who's just a pretty face or a walking wallet.
Exactly. And you'll be happy to know that the research actually supports that. They found that both men and women ranked qualities like kindness, humor, and intelligence as super important in a partner.
Okay, good. So we're not completely shallow. There's hope for humanity yet. But, it's all well and good to talk about these evolutionary instincts and these general tendencies, but how did Buss and his team actually figure out how people were judging these different sexual behaviors? Like, did they have some kind of morality meter or something?
Well, they had to get a little creative with their methods. In one study, they actually asked people to make a list of, actions that they considered morally wrong when it came to sex.
Oh, interesting. So they were basically crowdsourcing a list of sexual no-nos.
Yeah, pretty much. And then from that big list, they narrowed it down to 70 specific behaviors. These covered a really wide range from, like you said, those no-nos like infidelity and casual sex to more complex issues, things like sexual coercion.
Okay, and then what?
Well, then they took those 70 behaviors and they asked a whole different group of people to basically rate each behavior on a scale.
A scale of how morally wrong or right they were.
You got it. Like all the way from extremely morally bad to extremely morally good.
Ah, okay, so that's how they were able to compare how men and women were rating the exact same behaviors and see if there were any patterns.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where those fascinating sex differences we've been talking about, that's where they really started to jump out. For example, when it came to casual sex, women consistently gave much more negative ratings than men.
So even if a woman was, like, totally fine with casual sex for herself, she might still judge another woman more harshly for doing the same thing.
It does seem kind of contradictory, right? But it suggests that there are these other factors at play beyond just personal preference.
It's almost like we inherit these judgments, or they get, like, imposed on us somehow by society.
It's definitely a mix of nature and nurture, that's for sure. And speaking of complicated judgments, let's circle back to infidelity for a second. Because we were talking about how both men and women generally disapprove of it, but the research actually dug a little deeper into that.
Oh, right. You said the type of infidelity actually made a big difference.
Exactly. When it came to men, they were especially bothered by sexual infidelity, but specifically when it was their female partner who strayed.
Ah, okay. So again, it goes back to that whole paternity uncertainty thing.
Yep. Because for men, even the possibility of sexual infidelity, it triggers those deep-seated fears about potentially raising another man's child.
Right. It's not just about the betrayal. It's about those evolutionary pressures rearing their heads again.
Exactly. On the other hand, women were found to be more bothered by emotional infidelity.
Which I'm guessing goes back to the idea that if a man is emotionally invested elsewhere, he might be more likely to withdraw his resources from the family.
Right. It's like these ancient anxieties about survival and security are still influencing our modern relationships in all these subtle ways.
It's incredible, isn't it? Like,
Okay.
even though we're not living in caves anymore, those primal instincts are still there, bubbling beneath the surface. But it makes you wonder, if these moral judgments are so deeply ingrained, are they even capable of changing? I mean, the world today is vastly different from the one our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something that Buss actually addresses in his research. He found that our personal experiences, like our own individual mating strategies, can actually influence how we view things, even something like casual sex.
Okay, so someone who is more open to short-term relationships might be less likely to judge others for having them.
Exactly.
So that sounds like our past experiences can actually reshape our views on things, even stuff like casual sex.
Yeah, exactly. You know how we were talking about that study where they had people rate those different sexual behaviors? Well, they actually took it a step further. They use this questionnaire. It's called the Sociosexual Orientation Inventory, or SOI for short.
Okay, and what does that tell you?
It basically measures how open people are to, casual sex. And
Yeah.
what they found was really interesting. Both men and women who scored higher on that SOI, meaning they were more comfortable with short-term mating, well, they were also more likely to say that casual sex is morally acceptable.
So if you're okay with it for yourself, you're less likely to judge others for it.
It seems that way. It's like our own personal experiences, they kind of recalibrate our sense of what's morally okay.
So maybe those moral judgments, they're not as set in stone as we might think. It's
Yep.
not just all about biology, right? Our culture, the things we experience, our own values, all of that comes into play.
Definitely. It's a lot more complex than just some like hardwired instinct.
Right. Which I guess kind of brings us to the million-dollar question. If these moral judgments can shift, how might they continue to evolve as society changes? I mean, think about how much things have already changed, even in the past few decades.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what will sexual morality look like in 50 years? 100 years?
Exactly. It's like we've gone from these, really ancient instincts about survival and reproduction to this place where morality is constantly adapting, kind of like a moving target almost.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It's not just about the past, it's about understanding how we're still evolving today.
Well, I'd say we've covered a ton of ground today. We really took a deep dive into these 7 pillars of sexual morality, those differences in how men and women see things, even took a glimpse into the future of all of this.
And we've seen how those primal instincts, they really do continue to shape our relationships even today, even if we're not always aware of it. It's amazing how much our evolutionary history still affects us.
It really is. Well, listeners, that's it for our deep dive into the world of sexual morality. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that human sexuality, it's complicated, but it's also incredibly fascinating, and there's always more to learn. So keep those conversations going, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.